How you doing? Greetings, this is Dr. Bab. I am just recording a quick video. We had caught up pretty well with the midterm project, such that it kind of fell off the focus of looking at some of the things that Sherman has to say about business intelligence. Um, you're actually getting kind of a preview in Chapter 11 of data integration. Data integration is just this need to combine data from different sources and bring it together to provide this unified view. Um, and oftentimes, we are going to find that this data is just always not always clean, not always ready to go. Hence the 5 Cs. And the midterm project was really designed. I know that was quite a bit for some folks, but it was really designed to um, create a situation where you're going to have to put together different data. So we have the open flight stuff, and then the things that we're actually reading from either screen scraping or using some RESTful service. So we want to think about what is data integration, how do you architect for it, how do you design for it, how do you prototype for it, what are standards, testing historical data, and inconsistent data, which I think is actually the biggest deal. Um, there's a workflow to it, and I like, and these are admittedly from the book, but I like when these graphics kind of dominate these chapters. So we need to have a holistic approach, which says that we need to consider all sources. Um, we need an approach that's incremental and iterative. The chore here then is actually how we're going to bring all this data together. So that's sort of the what here. Um, we need to discover and learn from each sort of individual instance. So here's a good example. Bringing together and importing the um, open flights data was its own interesting journey. Once you all actually opened up that data, you found that some of this data is just not clean, or you had to deal with strange values, missing values, recoding values. It had to do with character encoding, all these types of things. So as a result, you have a kind of a really good entry into just that very problem. And then we had to turn around and get the service data from, again, either scraping or FlightAware or maybe flight stats, depending on what you used. So all these become fairly interesting. So we also need to make sure that this is going to be reusable. That is, that if we're going to figure this out once, and there's a good example. So we kind of set up to do in the midterm assignment, we kind of set up to do getting in the arrival data, and the departure data is slightly different, but the method should be reusable. We should have things documented, and then things should be auditable so that if you have accountability to things like Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA, um, just these various legislations and law that the HIPAA, Sarbanes, usually sometimes called SOX, which is Sarbanes Oxley. There, there are others, but all these is because you're subject to audit, and you have to prove that you're compliant. So if we think about an architecture, then architecture would be, well, we have all of our systems of record. So you're tapping into FlightAware, which is a system of record. You're tapping into open flights, which isn't quite. And we don't have things as extensive as an image like this. This is an enterprise level concern. We'll have to do the best we can along the way. So this is going to be aggregated into our enterprise data warehouse. So we have a staging where you probably have scripted cleaning some of these things up, and we could really script a lot of the problems that we've run into, even in our most recent project. Then these are going to hit an integration schema, which should be at least compatible with the um, um, data distribution schema. And then you're going to mark this out depending on who needs to, who are the consumers. And you might actually then tie that back into various reporting. So not too different. It's just, the concern here is aggregation. Um, you can kind of think of these things in stages. Um, let's have a look at something that's out of the book here. So Sherman encourages us, sorry, to think of these in stages. So in the stage one, you can kind of see it. Let me see if I can superimpose these. Yeah, it's not bad. So stage one, we have our systems of records, and the target is staging. Stage two, of course, is to go to your integration schema, then your distribution schema, and each of these are essentially preparing for further consumption. So it's stages of cleaning and purposing this data. Um, so these are these breakpoints here. In fact, it might have been better, it might have been more appropriate to put that table here. Yeah. So these are each of these breakout points. Um, so you do have to gather requirements because the integration itself is almost a new design, and we'll do this coming up here, so not long after you've watched this video. So you have to kind of gather requirements of why are you aggregating this data. Um, what are some needs and data quality metrics? For instance, is it important in the flight aware data to have an estimate time of arrival? Is a discussion I've had with some students recently. Let me see if I can get this thing to behave. Let's look at Postman here. So Postman is something we used in that project, and I was able to make calls here to Flight XML, and we have, for instance, actual departure, actual arrival. What are these? These are actually for departed. But here, some of them have estimated arrival times, right? So the idea would be, what's the necessity of all these fields when you're thinking about integration? Because it's actually the one field that's not there when you compare it to arrivals and that sort of thing. So you're actually, from these systems of record, you're having really a systems analysis exercise, which says that, what are the data source candidates based on our needs? This is usually when perhaps operationally you have multiple places. So let's say we actually wanted to get, and we will be doing this, some fuel information for the flights, right? So the idea is what could we start to do to gauge costs, right? And there's labor costs, and there's consumables, and there's certainly fees and that kind of thing that you have to pay to various airports to use their facilities. So, there are multiple sources, and you would need to identify them. So then you actually develop from your source systems, some of which, of course, are your own operational systems, some are others. Um, Data profiling is basically says, well, what's the nature of the data? And a good example is if we go back to FlightAware. Actually, I don't have FlightAware open, but if we go to FlightAware, FlightAware, and we look at this, which is the Flight XML, and we look at the Explorer, the idea then would be if we look at arrived here, this is the nature of the data, so integers, strings, and all that. And so this gives you a sense in terms of profiling. Then what are some gaps in quality? So we've had experience with that, and then we need to revise data and quality needs, and then we essentially decide that this is worth proceeding with, right? So um, you're going to have to, basically design table schemas for SQL, um, decide how, you're going to load this data at what volume, how far back do you want to go, is there any sort of transformations you have to do? What are some dependencies? What are some system dependencies? These are just things that Sherman talks about. Um, so the order of designing data models says that um, what when should you design what data model? So you've gone through your business and data requirements, and you certainly have profiled the data to see what's available. Here's a great case in point, right? When we looked at open flights, here we are. No, sorry, where's open flights? When we looked at open flights, um, we saw that they said, hey, look, we don't really have schedules, but here are some places you can source them from. And just having a look at each, we could see that they were each just a bit different. So the question then becomes, well, um, what's that got to go to our requirements? And it's not a perfect example. I know it's very much of a course exercise, and so it's not, not particularly compelling in that regard. But nonetheless, it's fairly representative of what the larger process would be. So our data modeling to go into the enterprise data warehouse. Then we have to see, is there any sort of staging concerns, particularly when you move on to the data marts and even down to the online analytical processing cubes. So each of these becomes a concern, um, and each of these are going to shape the nature of how you're going to set up tables to help you stage this data. So, that's effectively what he means by sort of having an architecture and having a plan and these sorts of things. Um, so let's continue. We looked at this order of designing data models. So there is a conceptual data integration model, which just basically says, well, where is this data coming from? And the conceptual data integration process really has you focused on sources and targets for each source with respect to data integration. So you're going to have a variable granularity in the model at this point, um, because you're really just sort of saying, where is this going to come from? Are we sure this is the right thing? You might have to really seek out, business people, management, um, subject matter experts in each of these sources. So these are the places that the data will come from. So at this stage, he's calling that more of this conceptual model. Um, so then a logical is that you're actually sourcing these with respect to sort of their types. So basically, do we have a source table? Do we have a lookup table? So it no longer is specific to the nature or type of source, but really what is sort of the role or taxonomy. And this then says that you're able to prepare for a physical model, which essentially is not that different, but you've literally identified what's going to be involved where. We have to do these two sources. That takes us off to this source. I can give you a good example. So here in this top drum here, we would have open flights. In this drum down here, we'd have the stuff from Flight XML. And then up here, we'll get something that actually lets us get the fuel. So basically, let me see if I can remember a website where I know you can look up the fuel. So AirNav has been around for a long time. But they have this page called Aviation Fuel. Check local fuel prices, and you can put in the area or zip code. So EGLL. Let's see if we can get something from EGLL. Oh, hold on. Let's look for. Oh yeah, and it found a bunch. Now, the downside of this website is it's only going to give you US data. So I guess that makes it a little bit. So let's say KDCA, which is Washington Dulles. Your commercial aviation we've been talking about only takes this stuff called Jet A, and we go here. And so what's interesting is that this becomes a splendid candidate for the screen scraping that we've been learning about. So you can actually pick up each of these prices, and you can see the price at the target airport, and then you can see it at nearby airports. So, the bottom line is that you're going to get these are all very expensive, A, but B, it's going to vary by um, how big or commercial is the airport. So things like where'd it go? Washington Dulles or Reagan National are, commercial air carrier airports, so it's going to be more expensive. So it's interesting how that all varies. So if that would be a good example of having that third stage. And then, we would have to have looked up tables to help us further do integration. And ultimately, then we're able to either take a piece of data and accept it as being something that can be integratable. What I like here is a rejects table. And the concept here, and we had a couple of these even in our experience, the concept here is, well, what if something, is not importable? What if there's some sort of issue? So, um, oops, sorry, I ended up closing something I really didn't want to close. No, I'm fine with that. Just give me a moment. No, I don't want that. I want this. Okay. So now, if we look at our systems of record, then these start to get us into ways of basically determining the schema design for integration. So you really want to come up with really a bunch of standards for the project itself, and then of course the actual um, schemas you develop for its integration. Now this is just taking back to the chapter where we were talking about database. So I use this word schema, but it just means the structure of your database. So um, we have a number of suggestions to, have source and version controlling, document requirements, document the application, development and implement test plans, document how you use the application, adopt naming conventions, and do code reviews or project reviews. Um, so when you come down to the actual um, design of the schema itself, then we could basically look at the systems of record, which is back here, way back in the beginning. These are all of our systems of record. When you look at the system of record, the idea would then that you want to standardize on, what is the surrogate key, and don't forget that the surrogate key links back to keys in the system of record. What is the application module name, table name? So the idea is you want to get some of this metadata together, such that it's easy to divine where the source of this data was. So um, you have to distinguish between, you have to establish standards for using keys, right? So you actually have the surrogate key, which is the primary key. You have the natural key, and I misspoke. If we go back here, the surrogate key is local, and then the keys back to the original source, back to the system of record, the key from the original source. So for instance, a good example is in the data for, um, whoops, in the data for, oops, sorry, in the open flights data, when we look at airlines or airports or whatever, these IDs here on the left side are all, although some of them seem to correspond to line number, they actually fall off of that pattern eventually. And though that's the natural key um, governing the actual source data as we found it. Um, so it's kind of just review, basically. These are things we talked about in a previous chapter. So you want standards for this. You want standards to actually keep track of when you're auditing, which means that how do you keep track of changes? And again, this is something we talked about in the previous chapter. And then, of course, as you have changes in the dimensions, right? You remember we talked about, that difference between um, treating things as tables versus dimensions, where we had measures, and that dimensions language is a lot, dimensions and measures, sorry, is a lot closer to what we actually see in a business intelligence tool. And then last but not least, you really want to then indicate what you want to do with missing or null or unknown or invalid values. And there's a good example in the videos I made for the midterm that I had, decided to recode things, and I really should have a standard for that. That's what's um, this is advocating for, rather Sherman's advocating for. There's a lot of other good things in the chapter, but effectively he moves on to chapter 12, and let's do so ourselves. And in chapter 12, we're talking about then the data integration processes. So the data integration, sorry, I can't speak. The data integration activities are really the most time consuming and resource consuming portion of building this BI environment. And isn't that the truth? Full disclosure, I had you do this very challenging midterm project because that is the nitty gritty, right? Once we get it smooth and flowing, picking it up in the BI tool and operating it is really not a big deal. And so I have had you go through an extraction, transformation, and loading process without a doubt. And, it was very challenging for some of you, and that's good experience. So we then need to put all this together. What are the tools that we're going to use to be able to do extraction, transformation, loading? And think about the ones we use. We use stand up a VPS. We use Python scripts. We use PHP myadmin to help us get that stuff together. And so all in all, um, we had uh, quite a bit of a journey in this stuff. So we need to think about access and delivery services, data ingestion, which means how are we actually going to bring the data in, integration services, data integration tools. So the scripts we wrote, data profiling, and think about data quality, transformation. We did a lot of this stuff. Hand coding, which I did some of that as well. Do you recall that in the chapter, sorry, in the videos for the project, I had gotten Excel out and actually had to do some filtering and all that kind of stuff. So let's look at the big picture here, in that um, we have to extract the data, transform it, and then load it. And great example is I got the dot files from FlightAware, sorry, OpenFlights, and a little bit of transformation by hand and Excel, and then we actually went to um, phpMyAdmin and helped actually import that. And then another process of extract, transformation, load is we wrote a script to either call a um, um, REST service from FlightAware or possibly even do a screen scrape. And these were things that we did ourselves for extraction. Transform is if you think about inside that script, I mean, you can basically, this script, you can see each one of these. So here's idle. I misspell that almost every time I type it, don't I? So here's idle, and I've got, oh look, it stayed large. Um, let's look at the recent files. Let's look at FlightAware. So I had set up all of this code to be able to do each of these steps, frankly, to be able to extract, right? So when I have this method called get FlightAware arrivals, I actually call the service URL, make this request, set up to be able to pull out everything that comes back from the request, um, to be able to set that up so that it's ready to be stuck into a list or an array that I can then use to write to the database. And if we look at the flight arrive class here that I made in Python, then this write flight aware arrival to DB um, method here or function actually connects to the database, prepares a statement to write to the database, sets up the data to associate with the prepared statement, actually executes it, does something, handles if there's any kind of problem, disconnects from the server. So that script has each of these pieces. It has the extract, transformation, and loading. Now, again, there are times where you're going to have to hand code this stuff, and we actually had that experience, right? So, for instance, let's look at the graphic he has for us on hand coding. So, um, there are times then that you have different external applications which have to be then shaped for a particular database, or you could have a database that has to be shaped for the BI tool. And so the reason these are multicolored is that each extraction, transformation, and loading scenario is going to be unique. Think about this from this midterm project you did. Is it not true that when we had the DAT files from OpenFlights, that was one process? I actually went in there, I manipulated or shaped it up by using Excel. But then when you think about um, the way we did the flight aware information, flight aware, when we think about how we did the flight aware information, we did it a little bit differently. We had a peek at the outputs of each of these APIs here, right, from Flight XML2. So each case was indeed, in fact, different. And that's the advocacy here. And so the idea then is that you're going to have to get your hands dirty to do this. It's not going to be highly automatable. So one issue though with doing it by hand, okay, so the advocacy there is that their hand coding, I'm telling you, is a fact, and it's you can't completely get away from it. And let's talk about from the book. He actually talks about some reasons that it's bad to hand code, right? I'm telling you it's kind of inevitable. But let's actually go ahead and cover some of the reasons. Bad, whoops, reasons to hand, reasons to hand. I think they kept on correcting me. Code integration Okay. And one of the ones he talks about is that you might say that tools are not tools. Tools are too expensive, and yeah, it's relative, right? And a tiny project like ours, it's not a big deal. If you're doing this over and over again, you'd want to get into some tools, and they do exist. Um, we would say that expertise is scarce, and so what he means by that is that basically we need to have an expert on hand, and um, we need to make sure they're involved because we don't know when they're going to get a chance to involve them again. Um, and then basically, there's a lot of unknowns. Um, there is, the data is live, right? Never sleeps. And so you have to, it changes so much that you have to kind of keep your hand on it to make sure, keep an eye on it. Um, forest versus trees. The idea is that you need to kind of be familiar with the details lest you lose sight of the trees for the forest. There's kind of an old saying. Um, we basically just end up doing it batches instead of um, full tool automation. And the idea is that we're again forestalling its change. And then of course um, one reason is that um, hand coding, and what they mean by coding is classifying, um, is actually once you get used to it, is a skill that can be learned. So the idea is that you can become familiar with it. So the again though the downside, I'd say that this is a reality, but the downside of this, of course, is that there's really a different method per. So you might actually do better in some respects cost-wise to try to get a tool. And the purpose of this graphic is to say that eventually the tools will start to pay for themselves the more projects you do. And so in many ways, you guys can see that the cost of sort of the hand-coded approach that we took was down near minimal. But we will develop reusable processes, enhance data quality, routinize workflows if we actually would use tools. So we didn't necessarily have a tool to use other than writing some scripts for the project that we had just done. So it's possible then that you can get tools to help you do this job. We're just back to ETL again here. And the idea then is that a tool will help you manage each step. And that's the addition in this picture here. You then actually can take a service approach to this, which sort of dissects or stratifies the concern into not really just calling transformation an ubiquitous monolith, but to say what are the different types of services, what are the names, and what would a data integration suite? And this would be a really expensive, comprehensive tool. It's going to have process management services to kind of keep track of the entire process as a project. We're going to have access services, things that'll help you connect to certain well-known types of data, profiling, ingestion, transformation. So ingestion is even that process of the import that we did with the open flights data. Data quality, things to flag. So in many ways, when we were trying to do our imports with the open flights data and we ran into issues, um, PHP-MyAdmin and MySQL themselves have a little bit of a data quality service saying, hey, I can't quite do that. That doesn't match what I'm saying, and so forth and so on. So these become really interesting ways to break it down, and then you can further subdivide it into the actual concerns, right? So up in the process management, there's error handling, audit, and control. We have source systems analysis and source and target mapping and the profiling, sorting, bulk loading, loading customers. That's a great one to study. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but it says that this is the fine detail of what a tool would really do for you. So clearly, the advocacy in the um, in the chapter, and I don't disagree with him. Sherman's advocacy is for um, having a tool. Um, One of the nice things is this then gets you set up to um, have better automations and sort of prompting for change data. And don't forget that change data is a big deal of being able to track in the warehouse changes over time so that I know if I'm looking at longitudinally a particular record, I know how to trace that back to the same entity. So pretty interesting stuff here. Um, in terms of what to think about, what are the uh, sort of overarching concerns here. Um, each of these services, the system will facilitate each of these services. So um, a good tool will allow you to, it will provide you with an access layer, a readily available access layer to look at source systems and divine the structure and content. What's the nature of the table? What's the nature of each column? Are any relationships detected? What are the primary keys? And how does that connect up to upper tables? So a decent tool actually, when set upon a source, do a lot of this stuff automatically. Um, I don't think, frankly, there's anything new there. Let me move on. Um, Now, you're also going to want to set up a table that then establishes your dimensions. And don't forget, we saw that in Tableau, where multiple sources then add up to particular dimensions that we then want to feed to the business intelligence tool. So you'd have a service constantly running in the professional integration tool that would take these sources and condense or clarify them into these dimensions. We'd also do that a service that would relate our fact table, which is something we've discussed previously, so that they can actually feed the dimension. And don't forget what fact tables are, is it's typically some measures that have been transformed. So in the lingo of Tableau, we're really talking about having uh, the facts, which is these measures, and then the dimensions, which are sort of what we're going to cross-tabulate against the fact table. We'll have an aggregation service, which essentially then um, creates reduced dimensions. Generally, average of this, the mean of that, the mode of that, gives us a digested dimension that makes it easier for analyses. We'll have an aggregation service which creates aggregate fact tables. So in that case, it's not necessarily fact reduction as much as it is agglomeration of the facts. And then the tool will facilitate um, jobbing this out, which means it's sort of running this at regular intervals. And you can see each of these 5 steps again. What I like about this concept of jobbing it out is that similar to what we did with the cron tab when we were running um, our Python script for FlightAware. So it becomes very similar. So these are just some things to think about in those 2 chapters. Not too much that affects us too deeply. I think that on our semester project, we had fairly adequately captured the spirit of this. Now, the next section, which I'm going to leave for a separate video, and it should be doable in just a single video. But the next section is actually on business intelligence design. I'll put this up pretty quickly, probably within a half day to a day of this video here. And that kind of gets us up to date in terms of moving forward. We're getting near to the end of the Sherman book, and we're also getting near to kind of working on your own data project to close the course out. So I'm gonna close this one up right now. The next portion is business intelligence design in terms of the next video. So as always, thanks for your patience. I'll see you.